The rain in Alderbrook never announced itself. It simply arrived, soft and gray, settling over the harbor town like a held breath that never quite let go. By 6 every morning, the street lamps along Marin Street still burned against the dark, throwing wet gold circles onto the cobblestones, and Elias Cole walked through every one of them on his way home from the hospital. He always stopped at the same place. A narrow shopfront wedged between a shuttered bookstore and a shop that sold nothing but candles, its window fogged with warmth, its sign hand-painted in looping cursive, Hollow Bloom. 12 tables. One long counter of scarred oak. The smell of espresso and cardamom that reached the sidewalk before the door ever opened. Elias had been coming here for 3 years, ever since his first week on the palliative care unit, when a supervising nurse told him, not unkindly, that a person who spends all night holding other people's grief needs somewhere warm to put down his own before he goes home to sleep. He'd found Hollow Bloom 2 blocks later, ducked in out of the rain, and never really left. He was 28 years old, tired in the specific way that only night shift nurses understand, a tiredness that lived behind the eyes rather than in the limbs, and he had a face people described as gentle before they described it as handsome, though it was, if you looked twice, both. This particular morning, a Tuesday in early October, he pushed open the door to the small brass bell above it, and Desmond, who had owned Hollow Bloom since before Elias was born, looked up from the register with an expression he couldn't quite place. "The usual?" he asked. "Please." He peeled off his damp coat and draped it over the back of his regular stool, the one nearest the window, worn smooth by 3 years of exactly this. Desmond didn't move toward the register. He moved toward the espresso machine instead, already pulling his shot, already steaming the milk for the flat white he ordered without fail, 6 mornings a week, for 3 years. "It's already paid for," he said. Elias blinked. "What?" "Someone came in about 20 minutes ago. Paid for your coffee. Told me not to say who." He set the cup in front of him, foam swirled into the careful leaf pattern he always made, and shrugged in a way that suggested he found the whole thing more amusing than mysterious. "I figure it's one of your hospital people. Doctor with a crush, maybe." "Nobody at the hospital knows I come here," Elias said, which was mostly true. He didn't talk about himself much at work. He listened. That was the job, to sit with dying people and their families and let them talk until the talking ran out, and then to simply stay. There wasn't much room left over in a day like that for anyone to learn where he drank his coffee. Well, somebody knows now. Desmond wiped the counter, unbothered, already moving to the next customer. Elias looked down at the coffee. Steam curled up from it into the gray morning light. He told himself it was nothing, a barista mix-up, or maybe someone paying it forward, the way people sometimes did, buying a stranger's coffee for the small warm feeling of having done it. He drank it slowly, the way he always did, and when he left, he told himself he wouldn't think about it again. He thought about it the entire walk home. His apartment sat above a pharmacy on Belhaven Row, one small room and a kitchenette and a window that looked out over rooftops toward the harbor, and it was, most days, exactly enough space for a man who spent so little of his waking life inside it. He made tea he didn't finish, showered off 12 hours of hospital air, and lay down as the rest of the town woke up around him, the mystery of the coffee circling in his mind long after he should have been asleep. He thought, too, about the shift he'd just finished, the way he often did in these gray in-between hours, before sleep took the day's weight away from him. There had been a man on the unit that night, 74, a retired schoolteacher named Walter, who had spent most of the night gripping Elias's hand and asking him, over and over, whether it would hurt. He had told him the truth, gently, the way he always did, that they would not let it hurt, that he would not leave the room, that he did not have to be brave, only patient. He had died an hour before his shift ended, quietly, his son's head resting on the blanket beside his hip, and Elias had stood in the hallway afterward for exactly 4 minutes, his own private, unspoken rule, for minutes to feel it before he had to move on to the next room, the next family, the next unbearable ordinary Tuesday, before he'd splashed water on his face and gone back to work. It was, he thought, drifting finally toward sleep, a strange kind of life to build for yourself. To spend every night walking people gently to the edge of the worst thing that would ever happen to them, and then to walk home alone through empty streets and let a warm cup of coffee, paid for by a stranger, be the only soft thing waiting for you. He didn't examine why that thought made his chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with grief. He wasn't ready for that yet. It happened again the next morning. And the one after that. By the end of the week, Elias had started arriving earlier, hoping to catch whoever it was, a doctor, a coworker, some admirer he'd unknowingly made in the elevator or the parking garage, but each time, Desmond would only shake his head and say, "Already gone by the time you get here." Comes in right at opening. Doesn't stay. Does he say anything? Or he? Elias had started to press. Just tells me your order and hands over cash. Doesn't want change. Desmond studied him with the particular fondness of a man who had watched 100 small dramas unfold across his counter over 30 years. You could just enjoy it, you know. Not everything needs solving. But Elias had never been good at leaving things unsolved. It was, he privately suspected, the same instinct that had made him a nurse in the first place, an inability to sit beside a mystery, even a painful one, and not want to reach in and understand it. On the 9th morning, there was something new beside the coffee, a small paper crane, folded from a page of what looked like an old architectural blueprint, blue-lined and precise. No note. No name. Just the crane, sitting beside the cup like it had always belonged there. Elias turned it over in his fingers for a long time before he put it in his coat pocket. He told himself, again, that it meant nothing. He was getting better, these days, at telling himself things that weren't true. He mentioned it, eventually, to Nikhil, a fellow nurse on the unit who had worked beside him for 4 years and had a talent for noticing things about Elias that he hadn't noticed about himself. They were folding linens in the supply room during the dead hour before dawn, the hospital quiet around them in the particular way it went quiet only in the deepest part of night shift, when even the machines seemed to hush. A secret admirer, Nikhil said, delighted, when he told him. Elias Cole. After 3 years of pretending you don't have a personal life outside these walls. It's probably nothing. Somebody paying it forward. With paper cranes. Nobody pays it forward with paper cranes, Elias. That's not a random act of kindness, that's a courtship ritual. He snapped a fresh sheet flat with more enthusiasm than the task required. What do the cranes look like? Old blueprints, mostly. Architectural drafts. Sheet music, once. So he's precise. Careful with his hands. Doesn't waste things. Nikhil raised an eyebrow at him, the way he always did when he thought Elias was being deliberately obtuse about something plainly in front of him. You've basically got a description already and you're choosing not to see it. Elias had laughed him off that night, the way he laughed off most things that asked him to want something for himself rather than simply provide for others. But his words stayed with him longer than he expected, turning over quietly in the back of his mind through the following week, the way a splinter makes itself known only once you stop moving long enough to feel it. 3 blocks away and 1 floor up, in the corner office of a small architecture firm that overlooked the harbor, Theodore Marsh stood at his window with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, watching the gray light spread slowly over the water. And thought about a hospital room he had entered too late. Theo was 31. He had the kind of face that photographed well in a way he found faintly embarrassing, sharp-jawed, dark-browed, the sort of features that made strangers assume confidence he did not, in fact, possess. He designed buildings for a living because buildings, unlike people, could be corrected. You could erase a line. You could redraw a beam until it held weight the way it was supposed to. People did not offer you that kind of mercy. His younger brother, Sam, had died 11 months ago, in a room on the 4th floor of Alderbrook General, and Theo had not been there when it happened. He had been there earlier, weeks earlier, technically, when he'd finally worked up the nerve to walk through the door after 2 years of silence between them, after the argument that neither of them had ever properly apologized for, after all the birthdays and holidays that had passed with nothing but the occasional terse text. He had gone, finally, because a nurse had called him. Because a nurse named Elias Cole had found Theo's number in Sam's phone under a contact labeled, simply, brother, and had called him at 11 at night to say, gently, without judgment, I think if there's anything unsaid, now would be the time. Theo had gone. He had sat by his brother's bed for 6 days. They had not resolved everything. Some wounds, Theo had learned, didn't get resolved so much as set down, mutually, like a weight 2 people finally agreed to stop carrying, but Sam had smiled at him, at the end, in a way Theo would carry for the rest of his life. And through all 6 of those days, it had been Elias who made it bearable. Elias who brought extra pillows without being asked. Elias who read aloud from Sam's dog-eared paperback westerns in a low, unhurried voice when Sam grew too tired to hold the book himself. Elias who, on the last night, when Theo could not stop his hands from shaking, had simply placed his own hand over Theo's on the bed rail and said nothing at all, and somehow that had been exactly enough. Theo had never properly thanked him. He had left the hospital in the wreckage of grief, signed papers, made calls, buried his brother, and by the time he surfaced enough to think of anything beyond the raw fact of Sam's absence, months had passed, and it had felt too late, too strange, to walk back into that hospital and find one particular nurse among hundreds to say thank you for the kindest thing anyone has ever done for my family. Then, one wet evening in early September, he had seen Elias by accident, through the window of a coffee shop called Hollow Bloom, sitting alone at a table by the glass, illuminated in warm light, looking so tired and so gentle that something in Theo's chest had simply turned over. He told himself he only meant to say thank you. That was the whole plan. Walk in, thank the men properly, be done with it. He had stood outside the window for 11 minutes and never gone in. The next morning, he'd gone in before opening instead, when he knew Elias wouldn't be there yet, and paid for his coffee, and told the owner not to say who. It was cowardice, he knew. But it was also the only way he could think of to say thank you without having to watch Elias's face try to place him, without having to explain who he was and drag the whole weight of Sam's death back into a room that smelled like cardamom and rain. He told himself he'd do it once. Just once. That had been 3 weeks ago. The paper cranes kept appearing, one every few days, each folded from different paper, blueprint pages, old sheet music, a page that looked torn from a novel. Elias started keeping them on the windowsill of his small apartment above the pharmacy, a slowly growing flock, and though he would not have admitted it to anyone, he had started looking forward to the mornings not for the coffee but for whatever small folded thing might be waiting beside it. He asked Desmond more questions. He asked the other regulars if they'd seen anyone unusual. He even, on one particularly stubborn morning, arrived a full hour before opening and sat in his car across the street, coffee thermos in hand, watching the door. He saw a figure approach at 6:02 a.m., tall, dark coat, collar turned up against the rain, moving quickly, unlocking something in the shop's side door with what looked like practiced ease. Desmond must let him in early, Elias realized. The figure disappeared inside for perhaps 90 seconds and then left again, just as quickly, walking not toward the harbor but up Marin Street, toward the row of converted warehouses that housed, among other things, an architecture firm with a brass plaque that read Marshvoss. Elias didn't get a look at his face. But he got the shape of him, broad-shouldered, unhurried in his stride despite the speed, a scarf the color of rust wound twice around his throat. It wasn't enough to know. But it was enough to start wondering in a different way than before, not who is this, but why him, why me, why like this. He didn't confront the mystery directly. Instead, 3 days later, he found himself standing outside Marshvoss at 5:30 in the evening, having told himself 6 different lies about why he happened to be walking past. The office was on the second floor above a shuttered print shop, reached by an iron staircase that ran up the outside of the building. Through the wide windows, Elias could see drafting tables lit by warm brass lamps, rolled blueprints stacked like firewood, and one figure still working at a desk near the back, sleeves pushed up, dark hair falling forward as he bent over a drawing. Elias stood on the sidewalk longer than was reasonable. Then, because the rain had picked up and because some stubborn nursing shift part of him had never learned to leave a wound unexamined, he climbed the stairs and knocked. The men who opened the door froze the way a person freezes when they've been caught mid-thought. Elias recognized him instantly, not from the harbor, not from the rust-colored scarf now hanging from a coat hook just inside the door, but from somewhere further back, somewhere that took a full 3 seconds to surface, because grief-tired faces look different from the faces people wear when their loved ones are still alive. But once the memory arrived, it arrived whole. "You're Sam's brother," Elias said. Something moved behind Theo's eyes, recognition, dread, an old grief resurfacing all at once, and beneath all of it, something that looked almost like relief at finally being seen. "Theo," he said quietly. "My name's Theo." Neither of them spoke for a moment. Rain ran off the iron railing behind Elias in a steady silver thread. "You've been paying for my coffee," Elias said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. For a month. I know how long it's been." Theo's voice had a low, careful quality, a man weighing every word before he let it out. "I wanted to say thank you. That was all it was supposed to be. I didn't know how to walk in and say it without everything else coming with it." "Everything else?" Theo's jaw tightened. He glanced past Elias, toward the harbor lights strung along the wet street, before he answered. My brother. What it was like, that week. What you did for him. For me. He exhaled slowly. I didn't have the words then, and every day that passed made it harder to have them. Buying your coffee felt like, I don't know. A way of saying it without saying it. Elias felt something in his chest loosen and tighten at once. He remembered Sam clearly, a lean, quick-witted man in his mid-twenties whose humor hadn't dimmed even as his body had failed him, who'd told Elias on his second night in the unit that dying was mostly boring and he resented that nobody warned you about that part. He remembered, too, the brother who had arrived late and stayed anyway, whose hands had shaken on the bed rail, whose face Elias had studied for exactly the kind of grief he was trained to recognize and had never quite forgotten. You didn't have to disappear like that, Elias said, gentler now. After. You could have just told me who you were. I know. Theo looked down at the drawing still spread across his desk behind him, then back at Elias. I'm telling you now. Elias should have left it there, a mystery solved, a kindness explained, a door quietly closed. Instead he found himself saying, the cranes. Where did those come from? For the first time, something like a smile touched the corner of Theo's mouth, faint and unsure of itself. Old drafts. Projects that never got built. I didn't want to throw them away, and I didn't know what else to do with paper that used to mean something. He paused. It seemed better than nothing showing up beside a coffee cup. I kept them, Elias admitted. On my windowsill. I didn't know why. Something passed between them then, not quite a spark, not yet, but the first small give in a door that had been shut a long time, on both sides. Rain kept falling. Neither of them moved to end it. Would you want to come in? Theo asked finally. It's warmer than a staircase. Elias, who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of staying just outside the reach of other people's grief so that he could carry them through it without drowning himself, found that he wanted, quite badly, to say yes. He said yes. They talked for 2 hours that night, surrounded by rolled blueprints and the smell of pencil shavings and old coffee, and it was, Elias would think later, one of the strangest and most natural conversations of his life, two men circling the edges of a shared grief, testing how close they could come to the center of it without either of them breaking. Theo told him about growing up with Sam, 4 years apart, close as children, distant as adults, the argument that had split them, something about money, about disappointment, about the particular cruelty two brothers can inflict on each other precisely because they know exactly where the soft places are, and the 2 years of silence that followed. Silence that Theo had assumed, wrongly, they had time to fix. Elias told him, carefully, the way he'd learned to tell families things without handing them more weight than they could carry, what those 6 days had looked like from the inside, how Sam had talked about Theo more than anyone else, in the end. How he'd asked, on the 4th night, whether Theo would come. How relieved he'd been when he did. He forgave you, Elias said quietly, near the end of the 2nd hour, watching Theo's hands go still on the desk in front of him. Before you even got there. He'd already forgiven you. He just needed you to know it. Theo didn't answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice had gone rough at the edges. Nobody's told me that. Not like that. Not so plainly. It's true, Elias said. I was there. I heard him say it. Theo looked at him then in a way that made Elias's pulse do something complicated, something he hadn't let his pulse do in longer than he wanted to admit, a look that held gratitude, yes, but also something warmer and more dangerous underneath it, something that had nothing to do with Sam at all. Thank you, Theo said. For all of it. The coffee was never going to be enough, but it was what I had. It was more than enough, Elias said, and meant it. They didn't call it anything, at first, not friendship, not the other thing neither of them was ready to name, but the mornings changed. Theo stopped hiding. He started coming in at the same time as Elias, sitting across from him at the little table by the window, and Desmond, delighted beyond words, began making them both flat whites without being asked, humming under his breath in a way that made Elias roll his eyes and Theo, unexpectedly, laugh. It was a good sound, Elias thought. Theo's laugh. Low and a little rusty, like something that hadn't been used enough lately and was slowly remembering how. Over the following weeks, the careful distance between them narrowed by inches. They walked the harbor path on Sunday mornings when Elias wasn't on shift, Theo pointing out buildings he'd designed or wished he had, Elias listening the way he listened to everyone, fully, without hurry, as though the person in front of him was the only thing in the world that mattered in that moment. It was, Theo realized somewhere around the third Sunday, the first time in over a year he had felt entirely at ease inside his own skin. There were small moments that meant more than they should have. Theo's hand brushing Elias's as they both reached for the same railing on a slick stretch of boardwalk, neither of them pulling away quite as fast as the moment required. A silence between them on a bench overlooking the water that stretched long and comfortable rather than awkward, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have stopped performing for each other. The evening Theo showed up at the hospital unannounced, halfway through Elias's shift, with 2 paper bags of soup from the place on Finn Street, because he'd overheard Elias mention, weeks earlier, that palliative nurses rarely had time to eat properly, and he'd remembered. One Sunday, Theo took him to the shuttered bookstore beside Hollow Bloom, which turned out not to be shuttered at all but simply closed on weekends, and which turned out, further, to be owned by an old client of his who owed him a favor and had given him a key. Inside, dust motes turned slow in a single shaft of window light, and towers of second-hand paperbacks leaned against every wall like old men catching their breath. I used to come here after Sam, Theo admitted, running a finger along a shelf of battered westerns, the same worn spines, Elias realized with a small ache, as the one he'd read aloud from in that hospital room. I don't even read half of what I buy. I just like being somewhere that smelled like his apartment used to smell. Elias picked up one of the westerns, turned it over in his hands. He asked me to read to him because his eyes got too tired to focus on the page toward the end. He always made me do the voices. Terribly, according to him. He did that to me too, as kids. Made me read aloud every night until my throat gave out, then complained about my delivery. Theo laughed, quiet and surprised at himself, as though the memory had arrived without permission and turned out, against all odds, not to hurt as much as he'd braced for. I haven't laughed about him in a long time. Mostly I just remember the ending. Endings aren't the only true thing about a person, Elias said. You're allowed to remember the rest too. Theo looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, and didn't say anything at all, just reached over and, very lightly, brushed a fleck of dust from Elias's shoulder, his hand lingering half a second longer than the gesture required. They left with 4 books between them and a promise, unspoken but understood, that this would become a habit. It was on a rain-soaked Thursday not long after, Elias off shift early, Theo's office dark for once, both of them tucked into the corner booth at Hollow Bloom while the storm hammered the window glass, that Theo told him the rest of it, the part he hadn't managed to say that first night on the iron staircase. I almost didn't go, he said quietly, turning his mug slowly between his palms. The night you called me. I sat in my car outside my own apartment for 40 minutes deciding whether 2 years of silence had already made the decision for me. Whether it was too late to bother. What changed your mind? You'd left a second message. I still have it saved. Theo's voice had gone thin, stretched over something old and tender. You said, he's still himself. He still makes terrible jokes. You'd still recognize him. I don't know why that was the thing that got me in the car. But it was. Elias reached across the small table and covered Theo's hand with his own, the same instinct that had guided him through 100 hospital rooms, except this time it didn't feel like a professional steadiness. It felt like something entirely his own. I'm glad you got in the car, he said. So am I, Theo said. Every day, so am I. Elias found himself, for the first time in years, looking forward to things beyond the walls of the hospital. He found himself thinking about Theo during his rounds, not intrusively, not in a way that pulled him from his patients, but as a kind of warm undertone running beneath the day, the way sunlight runs beneath clouds even when you can't see it directly. He also found himself afraid. Elias had built his entire adult life around a careful, deliberate kind of distance. He had learned, the hard way, in his first year of nursing school, what it cost to let yourself love people who were always, eventually, going to leave. His own father had died when Elias was 22, a slow illness, a long hospital corridor, Elias sitting at his bedside night after night, holding a hand that grew colder each week, and at the end of it, a grief so total it had nearly cost him the career he'd just begun. He had gone into palliative care afterward, in part, as a kind of penance and in part as a kind of armor. If he could learn to sit beside death every day without flinching, he told himself, then death could never again catch him unprepared. He had gotten very good at loving people gently, professionally, and always at a survivable distance. Theo did not feel survivable. Theo felt like the kind of thing that could undo him completely. He drove out that same weekend, without quite deciding to the small cemetery 2 towns over where his father was buried, a place he visited perhaps twice a year, always alone, always without telling anyone he'd gone. He sat on the cold grass beside the headstone, William Cole, and beneath it, the plain line his mother had chosen. He stayed until the end, and found himself talking aloud the way Theo would, unknowingly, do at his own brother's grave only weeks later, each of them confessing the same fear to the same silent gray sky in 2 different corners of the same small county. "There's someone," Elias said, plucking at a blade of grass, feeling foolish and continuing anyway. "I don't know what to do with wanting him. You always said I loved people the way I bandaged wounds, carefully, at a distance, hands steady so I wouldn't feel how much it cost me. I don't think I can love him like that. I don't think he'd let me, even if I tried." He pressed his palm flat against the cold stone, the way he used to press it against his father's hand in the hospital, in the last days, when words had stopped being enough for either of them. "I'm scared that if I let this be real, I'll lose him the way I lost you. And I don't know if I survive that twice." No answer came, of course, only wind moving low through the cemetery grass, and somewhere far off, a train sounding its horn on its way out of town. But Elias stayed another quarter hour anyway, the way people do, not because the dead can hear them, but because the staying is its own kind of medicine, the same medicine he offered every family he sat with at the end of every shift. You don't have to solve it. You only have to be here. He drove home slower than usual, watching the gray coastline unspool beside the road, and by the time he reached Alderbrook, something in him had loosened just slightly, not resolved, not fixed, but loosened, the way a held breath loosens the moment before it's finally let go. That fear made itself known in small, cowardly ways Elias wasn't proud of. He let a text go unanswered for a full day, once, for no reason except that Theo had said something warm and unguarded the night before. "I think about you on my walk home," which I never do about anyone, and the warmth of it had frightened Elias so badly he'd needed distance just to breathe around it. He cancelled a Sunday walk with a flimsy excuse about extra shifts, then spent the entire day pacing his apartment instead, furious with himself and unable to explain why. Theo didn't chase him, and he didn't sulk either. He simply showed up the following Tuesday morning at Hollow Bloom, same seat, same order, and said, gently, once Elias had sat down across from him, "You don't have to tell me what that was about. But I'd rather you tell me you're scared than tell me you're busy. I can work with scared. I can't work with a lie, even a small one." Elias had stared at his coffee for a long moment, humbled and a little stunned by how plainly Theo had seen through him. "I'm not good at this part," he admitted finally. "Wanting something enough that losing it would actually break me. I've spent a long time making sure nothing could do that anymore." "I know," Theo said. "I'm not in a hurry. I just don't want you disappearing on me quietly the way I did to you, back before you knew who I was. I know now how much that costs the other person. I don't want to be the reason you learn it twice." It wasn't a fix, not entirely. The fear didn't leave Elias so much as loosen its grip, inch by inch, morning by morning, but it was, he thought, the first time anyone had asked him to be honest about his fear instead of simply admiring how well he hid it. He hadn't known how much he needed that until it was offered. A week later, Nickel insisted on meeting him, properly, Elias, not just as a shape you mentioned once in a supply closet, and Desmond, overhearing the plan while restocking the pastry case, invited herself along without waiting to be asked. They ended up crowded around the corner booth at Hollow Bloom after closing, Desmond having flipped the sign to closed and poured them all wine he kept, unlabeled, in a cabinet behind the espresso machine for emergencies and good news, which are sometimes the same thing. Theo, who had braced himself for something like an interrogation, found instead an easy, teasing warmth that startled him. Nickel wanted to know everything about the paper cranes and declared herself vindicated within the first 5 minutes. I told him it was a courtship ritual, while Desmond produced, from beneath the counter, the very first one Theo had ever left, which he'd apparently rescued from the trash the week Elias almost threw it away in a fit of stubborn denial and kept safe ever since, in case either of you idiots needed proof, someday, of where this started. "You kept it?" Elias asked, half laughing, half something softer. "I run a coffee shop in a town this small," Desmond said, refilling his glass without being asked. "Keeping people's proof is half the job." Theo left that night with his sides aching from laughing and a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the wine, the particular, unfamiliar warmth of being folded, without effort, into a small constellation of people who had already decided to care about him simply because Elias did. It had been a long time, he realized, walking home under a sky finally clear of rain, since he'd let himself belong to something like that. He hadn't known how much he'd missed it until it was, suddenly, quietly, his again. The almost moment came on a Friday in late November, on the harbor path, under a sky the color of wet slate. They had walked further than usual, past the last of the shops, out to where the boardwalk gave way to a rocky point and a small stone bench that overlooked the open water. "Can I ask you something?" Theo said, sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, close enough that Elias could feel the warmth radiating off him despite the cold. "You can ask me anything." "Why nursing? Why that ward, specifically? Most people run from it." Elias considered the question longer than it needed, watching a gull wheel low over the gray water. "Because my father died in a hospital bed, and the nurse who cared for him at the end was the only person who made it bearable. I wanted to be that for someone else. I wanted the worst nights of people's lives to have at least one person in the room who wasn't afraid of them." "Are you ever afraid of them?" "The worst nights?" "All the time," Elias admitted. "I've just learned to be afraid quietly, so it doesn't get in the way." Theo turned to look at him then, and something in his expression had gone very soft, very open, in a way Elias hadn't seen from him before. "You weren't afraid with Sam? Or you didn't show it, if you were?" "I was terrified," Elias said. "He reminded me of someone. I couldn't tell you who, exactly. Just, someone I hadn't let myself think about in a long time." He paused. "You, maybe. Now that I know you. Something about the way you both go quiet before you say something true." The space between them had closed to almost nothing. Theo's eyes moved, briefly, to Elias's mouth, and Elias felt his own breath catch, felt the entire evening narrow down to the 6 inches of cold air separating them, felt himself lean forward by some fraction of an inch that he hadn't consciously decided to move. And then Theo's phone rang, harsh and sudden in the quiet, and the moment scattered like startled birds. It was the hospital. Not for Elias, for Theo. A late partner at the firm, a structural emergency on a project nearing deadline, a problem that needed him tonight, immediately, in person. Theo answered it with visible reluctance, his eyes never leaving Elias's face even as he spoke into the phone, and when he hung up, he looked, for a moment, almost angry at the interruption. "I have to go," he said. "I know. Elias." "Go," Elias said, softer than he meant to, offering a small smile that cost him more than it should have. "It's fine. Go." Theo hesitated one more second, long enough that Elias would replay it for days afterward, wondering what might have happened in that second if the phone had rung 1 minute later, or not at all, and then he stood, touched Elias's shoulder briefly, and walked back up the boardwalk into the dark. Winter arrived properly in December, and with it came the thing Elias had feared without ever naming it, the slow, quiet withdrawal of a man who had decided, somewhere in the space of that interrupted evening, that he did not deserve what he was reaching for. Theo didn't vanish all at once. It was subtler than that, a cancelled coffee here, a text that took 2 days to answer instead of 2 hours, a Sunday walk that quietly stopped happening. Elias noticed. Of course he noticed, noticing the small shifts in another person's presence was, after all, the entire skill his job had built in him. But he didn't push, not at first, because pushing had never been his instinct with grief, and whatever Theo was carrying had the unmistakable shape of grief wearing a different coat. What Elias didn't see, in those weeks, was Theo standing alone in the small cemetery on the hill above town, in front of a plain gray headstone that read Samuel Thomas Marsh and 2 dates 26 years apart, snow gathering in the folds of his coat while he tried, and failed, to explain himself to a brother who could no longer answer. "I don't know how to do this," Theo said aloud, his breath fogging in the cold, feeling foolish and unable to stop. "You'd probably laugh at me. Tell me I'm doing what I always do, building the whole staircase before I've decided whether I even want to climb it." He crouched, brushed snow from the base of the stone with a gloved hand. "There's someone." "The nurse." "Elias. You'd have liked him. You did like him, I think, at the end, more than you liked most people who weren't me." His voice cracked on the last word, and he let it, because there was no one on the hill to hear it break. I keep thinking that wanting him is supposed to feel like moving on from you. Like I have to choose. And I don't know how to make it feel like both things can live in me at once without one of them crowding you out. The wind moved through the bare trees above him, and nothing answered, because nothing ever did, and Theo stayed another 20 minutes anyway, the way you stay beside someone even after you know they can't hear you, simply because leaving feels like a second kind of abandonment. He didn't tell Elias about the cemetery. He didn't tell him much of anything that month, and it was that silence, not any single decision, but the accumulated weight of everything left unsaid, that finally became impossible to ignore. It was Desmond who finally said something, wiping down the counter on a particularly bleak Tuesday when Theo's usual seat had sat empty for the 4th morning running. "You going to let that boy disappear on you?" he said, not quite a question, the same way he disappeared the first time. "I don't know what's happening with him," Elias admitted. "Then find out." "You're not a man who's afraid of hard conversations, Elias Cole. I've watched you have them with strangers in the back of ambulances, practically. Don't tell me you'll have one with everyone in this town except the man who matters." Elias thought about that for 3 days before he acted on it. What decided it, in the end, wasn't Desmond's words alone but a night on the unit that reminded him, in the way only that particular job could, exactly how much time actually cost. An elderly man named Franklin, dying slow of a heart that had simply run out of road, spent his last coherent hours that week trying to reach his estranged son by phone, dialing a number that had been disconnected for years, growing more frantic with each failed attempt until Elias finally sat beside him and gently took the phone from his shaking hands. "I waited too long," Franklin told him, tears standing in eyes that had already gone half-distant with morphine and exhaustion. "Told myself there'd be time to fix it properly. Kept waiting for the right moment instead of just picking up the phone and saying I was sorry." He'd gripped Elias's wrist with surprising strength for a man so close to the end. "Don't do that, son. Whatever you're waiting on the right moment for. There isn't one. There's just now, and then there's too late, and hardly anything in between." Franklin died 2 nights later, his son never reached, the apology carried unspoken into whatever came after. Elias had gone home that morning and sat on the edge of his bed for a long time without moving, Franklin's voice looping in his head, "There's just now, and then there's too late," until the thought of Theo standing alone somewhere on the harbor, quietly deciding he didn't deserve to be loved, became simply unbearable. He didn't wait for his next day off. He went straight from his shift, still in scrubs beneath his coat, hair still damp from the locker room shower, and found Theo exactly where some instinct told him he would be. He found Theo not at the office but at the harbor, standing at the very end of the public pier in a coat that wasn't warm enough for the wind coming off the water, looking out at nothing in particular the way people look when they're trying not to look at something specific inside themselves. "You've been avoiding me," Elias said, coming to stand beside him. Not an accusation. Just the plain shape of the truth, laid down between them like something that needed to be looked at directly before either of them could move past it. Theo didn't deny it. "Yes." "Why?" For a long moment, Theo said nothing. The wind pulled at both their coats. Somewhere behind them, a buoy bell rang, slow and mournful, marking time. "Because I keep thinking about the fact that the only reason I know you is because my brother died," Theo said finally, the words coming out low and raw, like something that had been sitting too long behind his teeth. "Because you were kind to him in the worst week of his life, and somehow I've turned that kindness into this. Into wanting you. And every time I let myself feel something for you, I feel like I'm taking something that was never meant for me. Like I'm profiting off his death." "That's not what this is," Elias said quietly. "Isn't it? If Sam hadn't gotten sick, I never would have met you. I wouldn't be standing here. I don't know how to hold both things at once, grieving him, and wanting you, and not feeling like a monster for wanting anything good to come out of losing him." Elias stepped closer, close enough that Theo had to look at him, close enough that the wind no longer felt like the only thing touching either of them. "I've spent 6 years sitting with dying people," Elias said. "Do you know what I've learned, watching all those endings? That good things growing out of loss isn't a betrayal of the person you lost. It's the only mercy grief ever offers anyone. Sam wanted you to be happy, I know that, because he told me, more than once, in almost those exact words. He wasn't dying so you could spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for surviving him. How do you carry it?" Theo asked, and his voice had gone unsteady now, close to breaking. "All of it. Everyone else is dying. How do you let yourself feel anything at all, after watching that much loss? Badly, most days, Elias admitted. But I've decided it's better than the alternative. I spent years keeping everyone at arm's length because I was so afraid of losing them that I never let myself have them in the first place. That's not living. That's just surviving loss you haven't had yet. He told Theo about Franklin then, standing there at the end of the pier with the wind pulling at both their coats, the disconnected phone number, the apology carried unspoken into the dark, the old man's hand gripping his wrist with the last of his strength. He told me there's no right moment. There's just now, and then there's too late, and almost nothing in between. I spent this whole week thinking about that, and about you, and I decided I'd rather risk everything now than spend years being careful and end up like him, dialing a number that doesn't exist anymore, wishing I'd just said the thing while there was still time to say it. Theo's jaw worked silently for a moment, his eyes bright and unsteady in the fading light. You came straight from your shift, he said quietly, noticing, for the first time, the scrubs beneath Elias's open coat. You didn't even go home first. I didn't want there to be a right moment I missed, Elias said simply. I wanted this to be the moment, whatever it costs. Something in Theo seemed to finally give way, not collapse, but soften, the way frozen ground softens at the first real warmth of spring, all at once and yet so gradually you can't say exactly when it began. I've spent 11 months believing I didn't get to want anything good, he said. That wanting you was a kind of theft. I don't entirely know how to stop believing that. Not overnight. You don't have to stop tonight, Elias said. You just have to stop believing it alone. He reached out, finally, and took Theo's cold hand in both of his, the same way he'd once placed his hand over Theo's on a hospital bed rail, in a room neither of them would ever fully leave behind. I don't want to keep doing that. Not with you. Theo looked down at their joined hands, then up at Elias's face, searching it for something, permission, maybe, or proof that this was real and not some grief-softened mirage he'd conjured out of loneliness. I'm not asking you to replace him, Elias said softly. I would never ask that. I'm asking you to let yourself have something good, alongside everything you're still grieving. Both things can be true. You can miss your brother every single day for the rest of your life and still let yourself love someone. Is that what this is? Theo's voice had dropped to almost nothing, swallowed by the wind. Love? I think it might be, yes, Elias said. I think it has been for a while. I just didn't know how to say it either. Theo closed the last of the distance between them himself this time, no interrupting phone call, no hesitation dragging out into another missed second, and kissed him, there on the end of the pier, with the buoy bell ringing somewhere behind them and the whole grey harbor spread out silent and wide around the both of them, like a held breath finally let go. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was careful, and a little uncertain at first, two men who had both spent years learning to survive loss finally learning, together, how to risk something again. But it deepened slowly, warmed, turned into something neither of them wanted to end, and when they finally broke apart, foreheads still resting together, both of them laughing a little, breathless, at the absurdity and the relief of it, Elias thought, this is what I forgot I was allowed to want. Spring came to Alderbrook the way it always did, reluctantly, in fits and starts, green pushing up stubborn through gray until one morning the whole town simply decided the winter was over. By then, Theo's seat at the window table had become permanent again, and Desmond had long since stopped pretending he didn't watch the two of them with unabashed fondness every morning, sliding their flat whites across the counter with a knowing look that made Elias laugh every single time. They had not solved everything. Theo still carried Sam with him, would always carry him, Elias understood, the way anyone carries a person they loved and lost, a weight that didn't disappear so much as become bearable, folded quietly into the architecture of a life instead of crushing it. There were still hard nights. There were still mornings Theo woke with his brother's name half-formed on his lips, and evenings Elias came home from the hospital carrying grief that wasn't his own, needing silence before he could speak. But they had learned, slowly, to hold those nights together instead of apart, to let the hard things exist in the room alongside the good ones, rather than pretending one had to be sacrificed for the other. Elias had moved into Theo's apartment above the print shop by March, a slow, unhurried migration of books and coffee mugs and one stubborn, overgrown fern that Theo complained about and watered anyway. Their mornings had a shape now, small and ordinary and entirely new to both of them, Theo making coffee badly, on principle, because Elias always teased him for it and he decided he liked being teased, Elias reading case notes at the kitchen table while Theo sketched at the drafting board they'd wedged into the corner of the bedroom, both of them walking the 2 blocks to Hollow Bloom anyway, most mornings, not because they needed to but because some rituals are worth keeping even after the reason for them has changed shape. One evening in late March, going through a box of Sam's old things that Theo had finally worked up the courage to open, they found a photograph of the 2 brothers as boys, gap-toothed and sunburnt on some forgotten summer dock, Sam's arms slung around Theo's neck in a headlock. Neither of them looked like they minded. Theo had gone quiet for a long time, turning the photograph over in his hands, and Elias hadn't filled the silence, had simply sat beside him on the floor among the open boxes and let the quiet be exactly as long as it needed to be, the way he'd learned, across 100 hospital rooms, that grief asked to be witnessed far more often than it asked to be fixed. When Theo finally spoke, it wasn't to say something sad. It was to say, he'd have teased you mercilessly, you know. About the scrubs. About all of it, and then he'd laughed, really laughed, bright and unguarded, and pinned the photograph to the refrigerator, where it stayed. On a clear morning in April, they walked out to the small stone bench at the end of the harbor path together, and Theo pulled from his coat pocket a paper crane, the last one, folded from the final blueprint page of a house he said he'd never had the courage to actually build. "I want to build it now," he said, turning the little paper bird over in his hands before passing it to Elias. "The house. I designed it years ago and never let myself believe I'd have anyone to build it for." Elias took the crane carefully, the way he'd taken every one before it, and held it up against the pale spring light. "And now I think I might." Theo took his hand, no hesitation this time, no cold pier wind to make it feel like a small act of bravery. Just a simple, easy thing, the way holding hands is supposed to be between 2 people who have finally stopped being afraid of each other. "If you'd want to be in it. The house, I mean. Eventually. There's no rush." Elias looked at him, at this man he'd first known only as a stranger's kindness left beside a coffee cup, who had turned out to be grief and guilt and quiet devotion all folded into careful paper shapes, waiting patiently to be understood, and felt something in his chest settle into place like a key finding its lock. "I'd like that very much," he said. "Eventually. No rush." Eventually, it turned out, was 14 months. By the following June, a modest timber frame house was rising on a gentle slope above the harbor road, all wide windows and honest wood, exactly as Theo had drawn it years before he'd believed anyone would ever stand in it beside him. Elias came by most evenings after his shift, still in scrubs sometimes, to watch the frame take shape beam by beam, and Desmond closed the shop early one warm Saturday to bring the whole crew coffee and pastries, declaring loudly to anyone who'd listen that he had personally engineered this romance from behind his own counter and intended to take full credit at the wedding, whenever it happened, however long it took. "There's no wedding planned," Theo told him, laughing, sawdust in his hair. "Not yet," Desmond said, entirely unbothered, and swept back down the hill with his empty tray. On the day they raised the last beam of the roof, Theo brought a small wooden box out to the site and set it, without ceremony, into a shallow space carved beneath the threshold of the front door, a builder's tradition, he explained, older than he was, a keepsake buried beneath a new home for luck. Inside it, folded once more into the careful, precise shape of a bird, was the very first blueprint he had ever drawn for this house, the one he'd sketched alone in his apartment the week after Sam's funeral, not yet knowing what it was for, only that his hands had needed something to build. "For him," Theo said quietly, resting his palm against the doorframe. "So he's part of it too. Not instead of us. Alongside." Elias didn't say anything. He simply put his arm around Theo's shoulders and let the 2 of them stand there a while, in the gold late afternoon light, while somewhere below them the harbor went on being the harbor, patient and gray and beautiful, the way it always had been, the way it would be long after either of them stopped noticing it was there. They sat together a long while after that, the harbor spread out silver and calm before them, the whole slow unhurried shape of a future neither of them had let themselves imagine stretching out gently ahead. Somewhere behind them, in a shop that smelled of cardamom and rain, an old man would already be pulling 2 shots of espresso, humming to himself, certain, the way he'd been certain since that very first September morning, that some coffee is never really about the coffee at all. Some of it is about a man too afraid to knock on a door. And some of it is about the quiet, stubborn, ordinary miracle of 2 grieving hearts finally choosing, cup by cup, morning by morning, to let each other in. The end. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the quiet ways grief and love can fold into one another, or the strangers who show up in our lives disguised as small, unexplained kindnesses, I'd love to hear what part of Elias and Theo's story moved you most. Was it the paper cranes? The pier? The coffee that started it all? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe every heart deserves a story like this one, tender, patient, and true, please like this video, subscribe, and stay a while longer. There are more quiet, heartfelt love stories waiting for you here, and I'd be honored to share them with you. Until next time, take care of your own heart, and the ones brave enough to knock on its door.